Hello and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Cullerton. I'm the English Language Fellow here in Loja, Ecuador.
Hi, my name is Torres and I am the Academic Director for the Binational Center in Loja, Global Quality English, and I am so happy to share with you about reading.
So today we're going to talk about reading and book club with English language learners. And before we even get started, I just wanted to remind you that the PowerPoint may look a little bit small on your screen, so all you have to do is go to the gear section on the bottom and you can expand the PowerPoint and see it on your entire screen if you want to be able to follow along the reading. The only thing is if you do that, you're going to have to minimize to then go back to chat. The group chat's available. Any questions that come up during our webinar, we're really happy to help you and to answer questions, so please write anything that comes up. And lastly, if you want to see this webinar after it's been recorded, it will be available here at this website, or you could also go to YouTube. There is a Relo Andy's webinar, Relo Andy's channel, where you can see a bunch of webinars that I highly recommend if you're a teacher of the English language. So we'll go ahead and get started with the next slide, please. Great, so this notion of reading for fun can seem strange to many students. First, students really mostly they learn how to read when they're younger. And as they grow, then they start to read to learn. Less often, students read just for fun.
Reading for fun looks very different throughout the world. For example, in the case of Ecuador, according to the National Institute of Statistics for Ecuador, the 20% of Ecuadorians do not read. So from this group, the 56% of don't read because of their lack of interest. The 31% they don't read because of lack of time, and the 3.2% because of concentration problems. So the culture of reading in Ecuador isn't as common as in other countries.
And this is a challenge that we wanted to address. I'm here in Ecuador, and I would ask my students, what are you reading for fun? Who are your favorite authors? And they kind of looked at me funny, like, what do you mean reading for fun? We read for school. And this is very common throughout the world. This is the same issue I have with the students I work with in the United States as well. So depending on what country you're coming from today, it's something to consider. What does the reading and culture surrounding reading look like in your native country? And how will that influence teaching reading in the classroom? Next slide.
So what do we need to know? So before we get started, we need to know the definition, the needs, interests, and language levels of English language learners, access to text, motivation, timeline.
When we're talking about literacy, we're defining it in a very large way. We're not just talking about reading and writing or the ability to read. So let's go to the next slide here. Let's talk about literacy in this way that includes notions like social and cultural, oral language, history, reading, writing, multimodality, listening, and how reading is evolving. So the emergence of literacy has to take into account broad social, cultural, and historic trends related to the significance in reading and writing for human cognition and actually for communication as well. So it includes things like development and social learning and how text is mediated, right? So throughout the course of this, this webinar, I would like for you guys to really think about literacy in this very large way. We're not just talking about reading and writing, we're talking about all these other factors that influence the process of reading and writing in language as well. Next slide, please.
So, new and multimodal literacy. So social media, smartphones, tablets, computers, audiobooks. Literacy is changing. The way we read is very different. Now we have to function by comprehending hypertext, managing multiple tabs, and more all-wide reading. Audiobooks and technology are important for language learners because they build listening, reading, and critical thinking skills and help keep kids engaged.
Next slide, please. So just to carry on with this idea of multimodality, reading on a cell phone still counts as reading, and reading on a computer still counts as reading. Text messaging, although it may not always be the best grammar, still counts as writing. So these are additional things. This evolution of how reading and writing is changing are really important things to consider in a contemporary classroom as well. So this slide here that we're looking at is a survey. It's called a needs-based analysis. And you can change this depending on the needs of your classroom. This is one that I like to use with my students, and I actually change it up quite often depending on their ages and their interests and their language levels and that sort of thing. So I give them a scale of 1 to 10 before I start with any sort of literacy-based curriculum to get an idea of where they're coming from, right? So some questions I ask are included here. I read for fun every week. So, you know, they would circle 1 if it's not for all. Up to 10 would be yes, they do that quite often. 2, I can define my favorite type of literature. I have a favorite book. I have a favorite author. I enjoy reading. I do not enjoy reading. I have access to books for free. My parents and family members enjoy reading. I talk to others about my favorite books. And I'm open to reading new things. So the needs, interests, and language levels of English language learners, the access they have to text, and their motivation are all going to be really important guiding factors in developing your lesson plans. Next slide.
So what is important? Talk to your students. Be clear about your goal. Is it to raise level? Get kids excited about reading? Or teach about a new topic? Think about your objectives first. Ask your students, if you could read about anything or anyone, what would it be? What is your favorite genre of text? How much time could you commit to reading every day? What are your concerns about participating in book club? Getting insight from your students will help them with motivation, and it will help you better to understand the needs of your students.
Particularly when we're working with younger learners or even with adolescents, this notion of having a voice in the classroom or having some input or say is super important. That's why things like these surveys and having these conversations ahead of time, they allow us as teachers and our students to feel more invested in the process. Like they're somehow developing this lesson with you, and it helps a lot with motivation. Next slide. Now, actually, one of the biggest predictors of literacy and comprehension is how literacy is modeled in the child's life. And most often, this includes what does literacy look like at home, right? So in the family life, are mom and dad readers? Are there books or magazines or newspapers around the house? Are mom and dad or siblings using pen and paper to write down lists? Are they ever asking the children to participate in writing these lists or crossing things off the lists at the market when they're buying their groceries for the week? And then we're looking at, you know, what does literacy look like in the school environment? Is there a classroom library? If so, how old are the books? How are the illustrations in the books? Are they multicultural texts? Do they have diverse genres? Are they interesting texts? Are the students able to borrow them and bring them home with them? Same thing goes for the local library. A lot of students often don't know where the library is or how they need to get a library card, or the fact that they can also rent things like audiobooks or CDs from the library as well. So when I do these types of literacy-based curriculum, if you have an opportunity to do a field trip, that might be a great time to go to your local library and show kids around, have them sign up for the library card or whatever identification they need to rent books. Also think about this idea of internet accessibility. Do the students have access to internet at home? If so, that will change what you can give them for homework. This is something that's really important to know ahead of time. And also this notion of writing, right? So what does writing look like on the day-to-day life of a child, and how is writing being modeled throughout the child's life by important players. Next slide. Genres of text. Now this can be a little tricky, right? So I'm just going to name a bunch of genres here, and if you have any questions about them, feel free to write them in. So basically I'm going to give you a very, very brief overview of fiction, nonfiction, and informational text. And this list is not exhaustive. This is just kind of an introduction to this idea of diversity in text. So we have a group of picture books, and those are books that rely on illustrations. We know that these are super, super important with young learners and with early language learners, because this notion of visual literacy greatly affects language development. And when children are very young, they look at the pictures and they really find the meaning of the story in the pictures. They're not looking at the words. That doesn't happen till later. Another type of genre is graphic novels, which some people also call comic books, or wordless books. And wordless books are great because they help students with their imagination. Again, I've used wordless books with really young learners to help them kind of do things like make predictions or give summaries or guess what might happen next or what the character might be saying if they could speak, right? A wordless book is a book that has a theme and usually follows a character through a story, but there's no words. It's just all pictures, and they're a lot of fun for young learners. Another kind of group of texts includes historical texts, biographies, autobiographies, historical fiction. These are great to be used with interdisciplinary lessons, like if you want to teach an English language class at the same time as teaching a history class. We also have science fiction, fantasy, scientific textbooks, books about the natural world, and young adult novels. A lot of YA Lit often deals with kind of fantasy or sci-fi, at least as of lately. Those seem to be kind of the contemporary novels that are getting kids excited. And then we have just like your traditional novels, poetry, short stories, realistic fiction, memoirs. It's important to have diverse genres in your classroom libraries because all of your students are different. They have different interests, they have different needs, they have different hobbies, right? That's one reason it's important. And another reason it's important is because there's different affordances with these different genres, right? So whereas a poetry or realistic fiction might teach a student more about something like figurative language, your historical texts and autobiographies are going to teach an entirely different lesson to your students. Next slide.
Determining a timeline and vision. Is this a part of literacy-based curriculum? Is this extra? Is this a social club? Do students get a grade, a scoring tool? How can you provide access to these texts? How much homework will you assign? Do you reread as a group? Read aloud?
Great. Next slide, please. Another thing to consider when you're developing book club or literary-based curriculum is the age and the developmental needs of your students. So let's start at the bottom of this pyramid here. Early learners are going to do best with read-alouds, with a lot of repetition, with really rich illustrations that aren't just pictures of what's happening in the text, but actually take the student outside of the book into this entirely different world. Early learners need a lot of scaffolding. They need a lot of hands-on activities. If you're a parent or you work with young learners, you're probably very familiar with a student or a child wanting to read the same book over and over and over and over again, and that can get really exhausting for teachers and parents. So something to consider is how you can approach the book differently each time. Like the first time you can just read it straight through. The second time you can stop and ask more questions. The third time you can give pauses and have the kids fill in the words for you. There's so much you can do. You don't just have to read from point A to point B. You can actually use these books as tools to play with language and to have fun with language. If you're working with early learners, you also have to really focus on this of reviewing. You're going to have to review quite a bit. As you move up to intermediate learners, this is where you can introduce more of the group or the choral reading or some partner reading, group work, as well as independent work. And of course, the older the child gets or the higher their language levels are, the more independent they're going to become. So up to the top of this pyramid here, we have our advanced learners who often are more self-motivated to learn to read or to read and comprehend what they're reading. They're much more independent, but they still benefit from all the things before them. So even if they're advanced learners, they're still going to benefit from group work, from choral reading, from repetition, from scaffolding, and from review. Next slide, please. I mentioned this in my last webinar, and I come back to this slide a lot. This is from Edutopia. I left the link there on the bottom of the page. I like to revisit this because it's super important when working with English language learners. It's what are the most successful strategies? How can we make language most accessible to the students, right? And here are some things that we, Ines and I, seem to find that work quite well. So they include things like speaking slowly, having listening centers in your classroom, read instructions out loud, give your students opportunities for low stakes writing and reading, have games and cooperative learning. Don't be afraid to do experiential education, which is just really this idea of a lot of activities and hands-on learning. Give examples of successful projects. Don't just give directions on what the project is, but show them what a great project looks like, right? Maybe you can show them an example from a previous class or something like that. Use checks for understanding. Rely on oral language tools. Try to do as much partner work at mixed levels as possible, right? We don't want to just put all the beginners together. It's really great to mix them in with some intermediate and advanced learners. Try to do as many think, pair, shares as you can. That will give students the opportunity to kind of practice what they want to say before being put on the spot. Use independent work and review as much as possible. Visual literacy is also super helpful with English language learners. So include things in your classroom like outlines or pre-writes before you're giving them an essay, advanced organizers, and other visual guides. And be sure to write key concepts down. Now, we're covering a lot of information here, and please feel free to, if we're saying anything that's confusing or you just have a question in general, type your question in the chat box, and we'll pause and we'll answer your questions right away. So continuing on with more successful strategies for English language learners.
So we have also model new skills and be explicit about acquisition of language. Let the students use native language to support learning. Picture glossary, word walls, vocabulary words, visual clues, repetition, consistent use of terms, allow errors to happen.
Great, and this idea of allowing errors to happen is really helpful and really important, right? We don't just, every time a student speaks, we don't want to correct them. We want to give them some free time to speak too, where they're allowed to make some errors. Because the reality of learning a language is that errors are going to happen, and the more we shut down students for speaking because of small errors, the less likely they are going to be inclined to want to participate and speak in the classroom at all. So yes, it's important to correct errors, of course, but it's equally as important, in our opinion, to give students the opportunity to just speak freely without fear of any judgment at all. We'll continue on to the next slide. And here we're talking all about motivation. So if you're dealing with, this doesn't happen as much with really young learners. I tend to see the most issues with motivation towards like the preteen or the teen years, okay? And Some notions of motivation to consider to help increase motivation of your students with reading is be sure that your expectations are very clear and realistic. Give students a choice of what they can read. Make sure you have multicultural text in the classroom. It's important, super important, that students can see themselves in the books, that they can relate to the characters in the books that they're reading. Give your students a comfortable area to read, and also make sure that the text is actually accessible at the right level for your student, that you're not giving them something to read at home that's too difficult for them to even enjoy. We'll move on to the next slide.
Text difficulty. This all depends on the context of your objectives. Independent reading should be right around your level or below for struggling readers. For non-struggling readers, independent reading can be higher. Mediated reading should be at a higher level, grade level.
So this is something to consider if you're doing your entire class is reading the same text. Often, not all students in your class are going to be at the same level. So what do, right? What I would suggest is find a text somewhere in the middle so that you can incorporate both independent reading that is accessible for the students as well as group reading. Now, if your objective is just to raise the comprehension and literacy and oral language levels, then you're going to want to use a more challenging text that's either at grade level or even a little bit higher. Now, really, the higher level of text you're using, the more you're going to have to mediate the text. So the more you're going to have to do rereads and reviews and questions and answers, right? So it will take a bit longer to get through the book, but it's fine. It also serves a really excellent purpose. We'll move on to the next slide. And we're going to now introduce, kind of switch gears a little bit and talk about what is book club. Now, before I get into this next idea of what is book club, I see a question. The question is, what can you recommend for teaching English to pre-kinder students? Is it okay to use just pictures to tell a story, or do we have to use cards with the written text? That's a great question, and thank you for writing it in. I would actually suggest doing a combination of the both. So we know with young learners, they do really great with things like songs or repetition or practice, but they also are very visual learners. So the more you can model literacy and oral language, the better. So that would involve, if you want your students to chime in, you can absolutely do just having pictures and maybe practice some vocabulary and ask for them to come up with what they think is happening in the pictures. That's a great idea. But if you want them to practice, that would be good for oral language, right? But now if you want to work more with actually reading and learning how to read, that's when you would rely more on using word walls and vocabulary charts and some of these early readers. And make sure you always have really rich illustrations. I can't tell you how much that will help with early learners. Another question is coming in that how are books selected and what do you think about graded readers? So this is another great question, and this depends entirely on your context of your classroom and what text is available to you. At the end of this webinar, I'm going to give you some resources where you can find a lot of really great book lists at all different levels that are graded levels, graded readers, and also just really diverse genres of text that you can use at different levels. So whoever had this question about graded readers and how are books selected, be sure to stay on until the end, and the very last slide you'll find a lot of good resources. So let's get back to the PowerPoint now and talk about this idea of what is book club. Now, at the bottom of the slide here, you see that where the framework was introduced. It's this idea of book club. I learned this from a former professor of mine, Dr. Taffy Raphael. And her series of books on book club and book club plus are very, very, very helpful. And they have tons of handouts if you want to make worksheets, that sort of thing. So if this is something that piques your interest and you find yourself wanting to really learn about book club and use book club in your classroom or in your school or your community, I would highly suggest looking into these books written by Dr. Raphael. Basically, more or less, book club options change depending on the content area, the curricula, and if you're doing read alouds or if you're doing guided reading. Now the framework or the schedule of an actual book club lesson is going to follow what's written here in the orange. So first is your opening community share, which is just a mini lesson on knowledge, and it's appropriate to the age level and theme. It's a really good way to start pulling in some background knowledge and maybe introduce some new ideas. Next, we move to the reading component. This could be teacher-led or student-led, or in small groups, or individual, or it could even be large groups, right? It's just, and in that book on book club, or even if you just go online and Google it, you can find a lot of different ways of approaching this reading component. Next, you work into the writing component, which includes things like journaling and response logs, respond to what has been read, and also create new text. Have kids write on their own and kind of challenge themselves creatively. Next, we move on to the discussion component. So this can include different activities like fishbowl, small groups, partner work, projects, and you end your day with the closing community share. And this is really where you have the chance to link the reading, writing, and the discussion all to the theme. We'll move on to the next slide here on comprehension. So comprehension should be explicit. And when I say explicit, I mean students need to know that reading text is a process of making meaning, and that good readers use different tools and strategies to help them make reading, right? Comprehension doesn't just happen to us. It's something that we need to use tools to make happen. So try to name these literacy strategies as they happen so that they're easy to recall, and then describe the benefits, right? So an example of this is if you're reading and something that you're reading reminds you of something else you read, you can say, oh, time out. I'm going to make a connection with another text here. And this making a connection is going to help me understand the text I'm reading more, and it's going to help me be more invested. It's just kind of this like extra language and dialogue that teachers should always be having that is putting to words the thoughts behind comprehension, right? So just being explicit about what's happening when good readers read. What does it look like, and what does it sound like? Next is comprehension needs to be modeled by a more knowledgeable other. So that includes teachers and peers and parents and all sorts of people. Talking is not enough, right? Teachers need to think or have talk aloud so students can see how the strategies are applied. Multiple exposure to good modeling is necessary for students to be able to utilize strategies independently. And this really, these notions of comprehension exist at all different levels, from young readers up to much more advanced learners. Comprehension also needs to be supported with scaffolding. So they must be scaffolded by the teacher until students are able to apply the strategies successfully during independent reading or response to reading. As the strategies are learned, the teachers can kind of step back, and there's kind of 4 different phases in this stepping back. First, the teacher explicitly states the strategy. Then the teacher and the student work together, and they kind of ask some questions. Third, the students become more important, and they do more independent, I'm sorry, not more important, more independent, and they do partner or group work. And lastly, you really give all the responsibility to your students. We'll move on to the next slide where we continue to talk about comprehension strategies, because you can't talk about literacy and reading without talking about comprehension. Things to consider when you're using comprehension strategies in the classroom are different monitoring strategies, background knowledge, and text processing strategies. So Background knowledge, ways to invoke this prior knowledge, is ask students, what do I already know that helps me to step into this world created in the text? How can my personal experience help me understand what I'm reading? Different things to consider here are concepts of print, making predictions, using context clues, making intertextual connections, and developing vocabulary. Then when you're moving into the text processing strategies, these are the things that happen while you're actually reading, right? So what can I do to make sense of the text as I move through this text world? And this is where you can do things like sequencing, visualizing, identifying key events, making inferences, understanding literary elements, using genre knowledge, using perspective, using knowledge of text structure. Now again, we are going over a lot of things here. So if you want to use book club in your classroom and you can't remember text processing strategies, just go online and just type in text processing strategies for book club, and you'll get a lot of really great suggestions. Lastly is our monitoring strategies. So this is where students can ask themselves how they know if their knowledge that they came to actually makes sense or not, right? So it's things like review and asking questions after the fact and a whole bunch of other things. We'll move on to the next slide here. We're going to talk about writing in the book club.
Okay. So reading and writing are a reciprocal process. They need to work together. So for the writing objectives in a book club, we have to take into consideration 3 stages: writing into, writing through, and writing out. Writing into is all about set the stages, access or highlight relevant background knowledge, raise questions, set purposes, and create guiding questions, foster word recognition, connect to self, and connect self to tests. Writing through is all about chart information, identifying important information, identifying supporting details, identify plot points, explore characters and settings. And writing out is all about reflect and respond, personal, creative, critical, make text to self, text to text, and text to theme connections, extend text concepts.
So another question came in, which is really good timing since we're talking about writing. And the question is, do you see storytelling activities as part of a book club? And thank you for your question, another great question. I would like to encourage everyone to type in any questions that they have. We don't have too much left of the PowerPoint. We'd really love to answer your questions and have a dialogue with you. So in regards to this idea of storytelling, absolutely. The more we can model literacy as something that's fun and engaging and activating knowledge, the better. The more motivated our students will be to learn. So storytelling is particularly good when you're doing things like writing, because writing and reading are reciprocal, right? So if you're having your students journal and do response logs and then participate in their own storytelling activities, they're going to be able to practice some of the same strategies that you're trying to teach them with literacy and comprehension. Some other things to consider with book club is, do you want to do this in your classroom? Are you going to have time to all read the same book together in the classroom? What is the homework going to look like? Are you going to have them read at home? And how are you going to make sure that they keep up with that reading? Are you going to give them homework with that? How are you going to score their comprehension, right? Or are you going to give children free choice? Are you going to let them read their own books? And if so, how can you find themes that are consistent across those books that can support some of your lessons in the classroom? So book club is really multifaceted. There's a lot of different things that you can do. And we would just like to encourage you all to try to incorporate as much literature into the classroom as possible. It's going to be a really fun way to expose English language learners to the playfulness and the nuances of language, and also give them this opportunity to pick pick things that they're interested in learning about, right? Which really, as we mentioned earlier, helps with motivation. So let's move to the last slide here, or the next slide, on talking in book club. And so we know as English language educators that one of the things that we're aiming for is that our students have academic English. And this is another way that book club is great in English language learning classrooms, is because they really support this kind of higher level language and academic language and creative language and that sort of thing. So there's a few different types of talk. Talking sounds different when you're talking about a book, right? And also, another thing to consider is early learners, they're going to learn more vocabulary through a book than they ever will just through hearing words or learning songs. We're exposed to really rich vocabulary through literature. Different sections of talk include what's happening at like kind of the surface knowledge, like what kids kind of know a little bit about but haven't gotten too deep below the surface. Text inquiry, so what do they want to know about the book? What is confusing? Theme inquiry, so what's happening? What's happening in the story, and how does this relate to the world, and what is this? How does this relate to our own personal experience? And also reflection. So reflection after the fact of what did we like about this book? What didn't we like about this book? What would this character do if they were living in present day, or if they lived in our neighborhood? Does this character remind us of anyone that we know? There's some of the talking that surrounds book club includes this notion of declarative talk, which is really kind of just discussing, brainstorming, researching. Now another type of talk is really interrogative, and that's where you're asking questions and you're doing more researching. And the last, which goes along with reflection, is explanatory, and that's where students have the chance to summarize or to synthesize what they've learned and kind of relate it to the larger world. So we will move to our final slide here, and if you have any questions, please write in.
So most importantly, have fun. Share stories, talk about things that are confusing in the text, draw connections, personal with other texts, with your environment, with the world, etc. Provide support before, during, and after reading. Allow time to revisit, reread, and review. Does the book have a movie? Have a movie day. How are you going to pick your next book?
Great. And let's move to the final slide here, and then I see a couple more questions going in. So this is the references for today. And during the under the online area, that's where you can find some great helpful resources for using book club in the classroom. My website is alexiscullerton.com, and I have a section on book lists there. Another website that I could recommend is Early Reading First, or NCTE, or Read, Write, Think. There's really endless possibilities. If you're looking for book lists themselves, you can also go to ALA, which is the American Library Association, or you can go to Colorín Colorado, which is another website. We're going to switch over to the video now. Again, you'll be able to watch this webinar or download this PowerPoint as you need it. And we're going to answer some of the questions for you. So a great question came in that said, I think it would be helpful to explain the strategies and show some examples or pictures or videos with students in real classes. Thank you for your answer. Well, you're welcome, and thank you for your question. So actually, one of my previous webinars was called English Language Learners Literacy Strategies, and it's all about this, right? So the reason that we didn't talk about the strategies in detail today is because we really wanted to introduce the framework of what book club is, but certainly I agree with you. It's super important to know what literacy strategies are and what the framework looks like. And if you check out the other webinar that I gave on English strategies, you'll find a lot of helpful resources there. Another question that I see here is, can we include readers' theater in these clubs? And I would say absolutely. So you can use a lot of drama, or Romeo and Juliet, or Shakespeare, or all sorts of things. as your central text in a book club, or you can use it as a supplementary text. But the reason that I like Readers Theater is because it allows students to practice their oral language, which is something that I feel like lacks in quite a bit of schools. So Readers Theater is excellent. It's great, but I would really recommend that you make sure it's on theme with the central text of your book club, and that you give students a chance to role play. Perhaps they can act out the characters in the story. I've seen a lot of really creative things with theater and book club together. And Ines, did you have anything else that you would like to say?
No, just it was nice to share with all of you, and thank you.
Yes. Great. So thank you so much. We don't have any more questions that are coming in. Again, if you're interested in watching this video over, please stay on this website and it will be available for download. But also you can go to YouTube to Relo Andes and see all of our webinars there, as well as a lot of other really great resources that can help you in your classroom. So happy reading, and thank you all so much, and we hope you enjoyed your time with us.